I was planning on ending with Flamio, Hotman. But...
Yes, Flamio.
What? Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 36 of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. My name is Matthew. I'm one of your hosts. And I'm really excited this week because actually both of our hosts, Jacob and Paul, are both here with us today. So Jacob, Paul, how you guys doing today?
Not the worst. The land's not on fire anymore and the smoke is cleared, so that's good.
Paul, good to hear from you again. Glad you're back.
I'm just really glad that Paul was the one to talk first, because I was just going to be sitting here waiting for him forever.
Well, I think given the
I want to work on that whole queuing thing.
There we go. Given the topic that we have, I think that's going to be the last time I have trouble getting either of you to talk. Because we're talking today about a subject that I honestly don't know very much about, but which I know both Paul and Jacob are real experts in and are really excited to dive into, which is the TV show Avatar: The Last Airbender. I want to be clear, we're talking about the TV show, the animated series, not the film, although I'm sure we're going to have a couple of things to say about the quality of the film. But we're talking about the TV show, and I want to mention from the beginning we're going to be definitely talking about the whole run of that show, at least the whole run of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So there will be spoilers for that. We're going to try and avoid spoilers for Legend of Korra, because not all three of us are at the same place with that. But at least for Avatar: The Last Airbender, that one we're going to dive into in pretty good depth. So let me just start, guys. What do you love so much about this show? What gets you so excited about it, and why were you so interested in talking about it?
So, for me, one of the things that immediately hooked me to the show, and this will give everyone an idea of exactly how much of a stereotype I am, was its portrayal of martial arts. I've studied a number of them growing up. It was sort of an outlet for me, and also just a way that I could use to improve myself physically, in what to me was a very, very positive environment, and to see the kinds of things that I was learning, that I was practicing and doing, portrayed so accurately, move for move, point for point, in this really rich, mystical world it was a delight. I loved it.
I really loved the same thing about it as well. Although I'd say that it not only captures a lot of the good things in martial arts culture and, the martial arts themselves and the techniques, but, a lot of the good things like introspection and learning how not to abuse one's power. But it also captures a lot of the bad things, like the abuse of power by some masters, such as, Fire Lord Ozai. And I think it kind of showing that balance is one of the things that I really liked. And that kind of takes us into something else that I really think is just outstanding about this show is the characterization, the depth that characters are presented in. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later in terms of specific characters, but it's hard for me to pick my favorite character, and that's usually a sign of either a really good show or a really bad show.
I would say that's really fascinating to me because as someone who doesn't, I'll be honest, I watched a couple of episodes. I couldn't really get into it, in part because it felt like a kid's show to me. And I had trouble with animation. I recently, at Paul's urging and some others, gotten into the Clone Wars and decided, because of how much I enjoy that, to give Avatar another chance, which I'm excited to do, especially after this conversation. But one of my first thoughts was, and again, this might be my bias, but I tend to think of kids' shows or animated shows like that as being a little bit more simplistic. The things are going to be a little more black and white. So that's not the case here in Avatar?
Well, to be fair, it does start out, it presents itself as if it were a children's show, and it is ostensibly a children's show. So when you're first presented the material, it doesn't actually, it doesn't betray the fact that all of these characters have that level of depth. They do seem as though maybe it's going to be, your standard, here's the foils for the main character, here's the comic foil, here's the main protagonist, here's their faithful sidekick, etc. But as the series progresses, it becomes very clear as we encounter more characters and as we encounter reasonable and realistic motivations behind those characters, that even though it's still aimed at a younger audience, there's plenty of depth there and plenty of things for people who are more mature to enjoy.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I'd say a particularly striking example for me is Prince Zuko, who is cast as the primary antagonist through much of season one, and especially in those first few episodes. He's, this kind of he comes off as just a generic, like, angry teenager, who's like, I must catch the protagonists, like, because it's what I'm supposed to do, right? And then he has this uncle who, in the beginning, feels like this very kind of generic, wise old dude, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But the dynamic between those two characters, I mean, it stays, like, all of that is part of who those characters are, right? But it evolves, and you get a lot more detail, and you understand why the uncle is sort of playing the role he's playing to the prince, why the prince is the way he is. And so it comes out of these kind of stereotypical character archetypes, and then it really develops them as people. And I'd say the show does that with a lot of the characters. Right. So I can understand how in the beginning it's a little harder to get into, especially if you're thinking, oh, it's just like a kid's show. And it is very silly a lot of the times, but it really does a great job of developing.
Where this really shines, where this really comes out, is in characters that we are introduced to for the first time later in the show that could be set up as just sort of one-shot, no real depth to them, no backstory, nothing that makes sense, and that's not what we get. Right? There's an opportunity for them to take that kind of lazy approach and say, this is, these people are rebelling and doing these things. They're being destructive to the environment around them because they're just a bunch of troubled kids who have made their own kind of band. They're basically the Lost Boys. Insert the Lost Boys from Peter Pan. That's who these guys are. But instead, we get Jet and his gang, and they actually have each of them, even the ones that barely talk, have a reasonable backstory. And yeah,
I mean, it sounds like one of the things that the show is really good at is world building. I mean, I know it obviously is set in a world that is, you can sort of draw some analogies to our own, but it's for the most part a completely unique world. And from my understanding, both in talking to you guys and talking to others, is that the show really does a great job in making it not only a rich and a full world, but a very consistent world, and one where it seems like the actions of the characters are affecting things around them.
I would say it does that. Like, one thing just for this show to me is I feel like, especially since it was 3 seasons, it was clearly always supposed to be 3 seasons, and they were very successful, and they still just did 3 seasons. It was clear to me that they had a map for the story they wanted to tell, and they just went out and told that story.
Yeah. And the only deviations I think they might have made had to do with a certain voice actor passing away.
Yeah.
Because there were definitely scenes where I feel like the character would have been talking and wasn't while they were finding somebody to replace them. Yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to make you sad. Everybody who's seen the show or knew of Mako before the show, that's something that we all share that pain. He was a great asset to the show.
And that's something we've talked about before, especially Jacob, you and I with Babylon 5 and with some other shows, that there's such a value in shows knowing where they're going from the beginning. I mean, and that a lot of things I think we're often most critical of, story-wise at least, are the shows where it seems like they set up a question in season 1 and they have no idea how they're going to answer it, and so the consistency just isn't there.
Lost.
Yeah.
I love how we went for the exact same gag with 2 different shows.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so I heard Paul's was Lost. What was yours, Jacob?
Battlestar Galactica, the new BSG. The writer's strike, I think, had some to do with that.
Same with Lost, but
sure. So
and Heroes, and the writer's strike was bad for continuity in television.
As well, it should have been.
Yeah, of course,
definitely.
Gotta make it hurt. Anyway, that has nothing to do with The Last Airbender.
Yep. Well, so let's dive a little bit more into this. So, I know one of the first topics that we really want to talk about was the character. And tell me if I get the pronunciation right. Aang? Is that right? Aang. Okay. So what's going on with this character? What makes this character so interesting to you guys, especially in terms of like the ethical questions we're talking about?
So Aang is the titular character. In I believe it was in Canada, it was subtitled Legend of Aang rather than The Last Airbender. So it's his story.
Yeah.
Right. Aang.
He's also the last Airbender.
Right. He is literally the last of his people, of his lineage, as it were. And so he's in this very unique spot, this very unique place, and there are affectations to this character that are very interesting. Like, for example, he speaks with his voice has an affectation to it that's a little bit abnormal. I don't want to call it a lisp because it's not quite a lisp. Do you know what I'm talking about, Paul, when I'm talking about Aang's voice?
I do, kind of. I mean, he sounds like... I mean, the thing about the character is, you know, when he was 12, he found out that he's this, like, super important person or whatever, and it was a ton of responsibility for him, and he freaked out, and he ended up getting frozen in ice for 100 years, as, you know, people do, like Captain America.
Right. That's what you do. You pack up your stuff and you run away from your problems.
Right. And then you get frozen in ice. Yeah. And, like, so, he is a character that's very much out of his time, right? Mm-hmm. And so I do know what you mean about the voice. I guess I wouldn't really know how to pinpoint it either, but he does, both his voice and the character himself, the way he acts, his outlook on the world, feel like they're very much removed from the present situation in that world.
Right. He's been gone 100 years, as a context for the people who don't know the show. He's been gone 100 years, and in that time, a nation of peoples that he had friends there, mm-hmm. right? Just got to this point where they started waging war against all of the other nations, invading and conquering, in an effort to effectively unify the world. Mm-hmm. Which we've heard that story before.
Right. And they killed all of his people, just like...
Right. And also, by the way, Aang, none of your ancestors exist because they were all slaughtered by this nation. So he comes out of his little ice shell and learns of this. And, yeah. But the thing we wanted to talk about specifically about Aang, because it's a character trait we don't see very often, even when we should, Iron Fist, is that Aang is a vegetarian.
Mm.
So, go on.
Oh no. Well, just like there's not a lot of vegetarians in fiction. Like, right. You know, there's a lot of times a character is, I guess, indeterminate in terms of their diet, right? There are plenty of characters in fiction that we don't really see eating, but you know, there aren't a lot of characters where it's like, yes, this character's a vegetarian. And a lot of the times on something like Iron Fist, right, where the character's supposed to be a vegetarian, or he was, like, raised vegetarian, he's like, but we snuck off and ate donkeys, you know? Right. And it's, like, played for laughs, basically.
Right, and you're talking in the TV show Iron Fist, because in the comic book, he is just a vegetarian across the board. That was one of the things they changed for the TV show.
For the Netflix TV show, there's something... Ultimate Spider-Man, I think, which is an animated series, which I actually feel like has a much better Iron Fist.
Oh, really?
And, wouldn't be hard.
Right, exactly. It's got Iron Fist, Luke Cage, and, you know, a couple other people, and Spider-Man, and, you know, but, like, as teenagers, and he's like, yeah, I'm a vegetarian. I think he's actually vegan or whatever, but, like, you know, it fits more with his character, you know, and I actually feel like not being a vegetarian fits with the Danny Rand in the Netflix show.
Yeah.
For his actual characterization, yeah.
Right. And, you know, but it seems to me like a little, I don't know, it's like, why would you make that choice, you know, as a filmmaker? It's interesting, like Luke Cage has a vegetarian, sort of.
Yeah, the cop, he's a vegan, I think.
Right. I don't think he mentions it, but just he's like, no, I don't eat that, you know, and it's like, that's it. And they don't ever even say vegetarian, I don't think, but like, it's just like, you know, it's like, yeah, like.
It's just an interesting bit of world building in Luke Cage.
Right, exactly. It's just, you know, something about a character, right?
Getting back to Aang specifically. Yeah. So one of the things that is interesting about this portrayal is that it, obviously, where we're talking about it, we're talking about vegetarians in media and fiction at some length here, so makes people think that, okay, they obviously make a very big deal out of this. But interestingly, I would argue they don't make a big deal out of it. The showrunners call it out in certain spots by having Aang say, I don't eat meat, when he's off.
Right.
And the fact that every character's reaction is like the most, quote, judgmental, unquote, reaction you get from somebody is they shrug. Right,
yeah. Like Sokka, who's the most, like, virulent meat eater. You know, he's like, oh, more for me, you know?
Yeah, they actually play up, I feel, Sokka's carnivorous tendencies in order to contrast with Aang better, in order to show that like they're not passing judgment on either of these choices. But they do make it very clear that this is a central part of Aang that he's not willing to compromise.
Well, to me, that's fascinating because it sounds like what they've done is to make this a part of the character, but also, first of all, not to play it for laughs, which I think is one of the most obvious things you could do with this, and also not to make it one note. You know, I mean, I think it's interesting. This question of are they making a big deal of it or not? It seems like it's such a cliche, but it's like they're making a big deal out of not making a big deal of it because that's clearly a very my understanding at least is that seems like it's a very conscious choice to say we're going to introduce this concept into the world, but not either play it as strident, hit you over the head with it, or play it for laughs. We're kind of normalizing this topic by saying this is a part of this character and this is who he is, but it's accepted, even if it's not everyone is on the same page with it.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to representation in fiction, that's one of the two things like you need to do. You know, I think it's a great thing to do is to basically just take some characteristic that a person could have, whether it's a choice or some, you know, however they were born or something, you know, that they acquired through their life, and just be like, yeah, this character, you know, that's just part of that character, and not make a big deal out of it, but like have it clearly be an essential part of that character, right? It's not the defining characteristic of, like, Aang being a vegetarian isn't his single defining characteristic, but it is a defining characteristic. It influences who he is, but it's not like an overwhelming characteristic. And I think, you know, the other thing is, like, you can also have some stories that do tackle those sorts of things. You know, whatever people with certain aspects, identities, whatever, encounter. Like, I think it's important that there is fiction that tackles those issues, right? But every time you have a character with some quality like that, you don't always have to have that be the story, right? And just including characters with whatever qualities in a kind of just casual, like, yeah, you know, he's a vegetarian, and I think is helpful.
There's multiples of this same kind of idea in characters in the show, even multiple instances where a character has something about themselves that is clearly integral to who they are. It's an integral part of who they are, but it's not made the focus of any major plot points. It's not effective. I guess the way I want to say this is it's not abused for the sake of story. Right? There's never a point where Aang's all like, I'm starving to death and there is nary a vegetable to be found. There's nothing like that happening, right?
Yeah.
He's never faced with some sort of moral conflict where, like, he has to eat meat to prevent his friends getting hurt,
or he dies,
stupid like that.
Yep. Right, that would be so contrived and stupid, but yes, thankfully that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's sad to say this, but I'm surprised to hear that, because it feels like that is such an easy trope that writers go to, of saying, if we create a character who has this very strong moral precept, we're at some point going to create a situation where artificially that character has to decide, is that moral precept more important than some other thing?
And here I want to give the writers some credit, because I feel like with the character of Aang, one of the things they wanted to do with his vegetarianism is kind of make a statement to children watching the show, being like, this is okay. There's nothing wrong with this. You're not going to be put in some situation where this is a disadvantage. This is just a valid life decision. Yeah,
they do, and I think that's great. And there is one... So he kind of has an instance that's like that isn't that way about him being a vegetarian, but spoiler alert, at the end of the show...
about his pacifism, yeah.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
He's a vegetarian, like, not just like, I like animals, they're my friends. Like, his best friend is a flying sky bison, right?
Right.
Like, so he does have this connection to animals. But it's also like do no harm, like do not kill, like don't harm others. And, so he's faced with this quandary of, like, everybody's like, yeah, you need to go kill the big bad, right? And he's like, but I don't want to kill him. So, he does have that moment of kind of like looking for another way, but it's not like in order to like eat today, it's like in order to save the world. So it's like it feels less contrived than if they had a little story that was about like, oh, they're starving and
Right.
will they eat Appa? Like
he literally has that problem because the central plot of the entire show is let's stop the Fire Nation from conquering all of these other people.
right.
And in order to do that, you have to depose their ruler. And everyone's going into this, by the end of it, assuming that Aang's just going to take him out, going to kill him, and it'll all be better. And Aang's terrified by this idea.
Mm-hmm.
He has problems with this. And I actually feel the way the show ultimately resolved that. I know a lot of people thought initially it was kind of a cop-out. I really liked it.
I really like it too.
It was a very spiritual way. It was very much in line with Aang's character, that he meditated, he fussed, and he tortured himself over how do I solve this problem, and then makes a connection with this ancient creature
Island sea turtle.
The lion turtles. You had these creatures that are almost timeless. That's going to Korra, but where we learn that the lion turtles have been around for eons and eons, but and gave the people bending, right? He finds one of these and makes a connection with that and finds another way that is in line with his own moral principles, so he doesn't have to betray himself in order to solve these problems. I thought it was beautiful.
I did too. I just felt like it really fit the series and was like it kind of brought it around and let it be itself, without kind of forcing a like, okay, now it's time to grow up and kill people,
Right.
Like I think that would have felt kind of unnatural in this series.
In that specifically, that specific point is one of the reasons I loved it so much, is that I've seen that trope where, you gotta bite the bullet and do this thing that makes you uncomfortable because that's the mature thing to do. And to have a series come around and end with the lesson of you can find a peaceful resolution even to this incredibly difficult problem.
Yeah. I mean, this is going to sound like a weird connection, but I was thinking about the same topic recently because I just reread the Harry Potter books. And I love those books on so many levels, and in some ways they're problems. But one thing I always thought was a little weird is, Dumbledore makes such pains to tell Harry, like, the prophecy about you and Voldemort, it's only prophecy. It only has to come true because you think it has to come true, and all of this kind of stuff. But yet you got to kill Voldemort. And there's never any discussion of there being another alternative.
Right.
Especially because at one point we learned that the other sort of awful, terrible, dark wizard, Grindelwald, has been imprisoned this whole time.
Right.
And not to go too
Who
far.
I think is the secret hero in the stories. But go ahead.
That's a theory.
I can't wait to hear that story, but that's for another time.
But yes, but I think that's. I remember being a little disappointed by those books, and I really like this idea because it's the same reason we talked a while ago, Paul and I, about Doctor Strange. And Doctor Strange doesn't do it out of some hatred of violence. He does it because you just can't defeat this monster.
Right. He can't physically overcome it.
Yeah.
But it's so rare, I think, that we get stories where the character's presented with you have to kill this bad guy, and the character's able to come up with some other choice. Go ahead.
No, I agree with everything you're saying, but I think Harry Potter is actually a really interesting example. I read book 7 when it came out, and I haven't reread it since then, and I only saw the films that were based on it, kind of. But I thought that one of the most interesting things was that at the beginning of book 7, they know which one of the fake Harrys or whatever is Harry because of the spell that he uses.
Right.
Because that's what he does, right? He disarms.
It's a disarming spell. It's not a spell to kill.
Yeah,
right, and that's what he does at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
At the end, he uses that, so he's not necessarily trying to kill Voldemort, right? He disarms him. He's trying to take away his power, which is actually, and I don't remember how it actually ended up ending. Maybe he blew up or whatever, but But I do remember in the movie, I felt like they didn't play up that angle. And I thought that angle was very, clever and interesting and kind of appropriate for like a kid's book that isn't totally a kid's book, but that is like, there are other ways. And obviously in the real world, you're not necessarily always going to find like option 3, right? But the point I think is that there's always value in looking for it. That if you can take someone who's got a lot of power and they're abusing that power to hurt other people, and you can take that power away from them, then they're not going to be hurting people anymore. You don't have to kill them, right?
Right. Well, and so with that, tell me more about, it sounds like Aang's vegetarianism flows a lot from the rest of his character. It's not just like this weird quirk. I mean, you guys briefly mentioned his pacifism, obviously. Tell me a little bit more about other parts of his character and how he sort of lives out these ideals throughout the show.
Well, and a lot of this actually you can see in how Aang chooses to fight. And one of the things I love about this is that they made Aang, they made Aang an airbender, and they made airbending based on Patois, which is one of the internal styles, and it's one that is there. And I don't usually like using these terms because I feel they're overly simplistic for making distinctions. But it's one of the softer forms. You're talking about.
Now, when you say forms, you need forms of martial art?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
So you have. So generally speaking, you can create this arbitrary distinction in martial arts between ones where the objective is to use your strength, your force, to strike another person in some way and to optimize that in mechanically put yourself in a position to maximize those efforts. And then there are the ones that are more about taking advantage of other people's energy and using it against them. Tai Chi is the one that most people know about that operates on this principle and is the one that does that the most often. Patois does a lot of this sort of re-angling to do that same kind of thing, where somebody is coming at you, striking at you, and hopefully I'm explaining this well. It's much more easy if I can show, but obviously the audio media is limited in what I can show people visually. Go and look up all you need to do is type PA space QUA in YouTube, and you will find a video of people doing this. But it's very fluid, and one of the things it does is it redirects, right? Anybody who's trying to attack you, you redirect them. You redirect that energy. And when Aang is having confrontations with people, most of what he does is that. He very rarely actually strikes directly at somebody. Most of what he's doing is to push what they're doing to the side, deflect what they're doing toward him, and a lot of the time while he's doing that, while he's fighting them, he's trying to reason with them. Even people who have come at him time and time again and proven that they're just going to, like when he's fighting Zhao, proven that they're just going to doggedly pursue and try to do him harm, and he's still like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to fight you. And I just, obviously I'm very much in love with this character and his portrayal as the main hero for this story, because it is a story about people fighting each other constantly. Right. We have this world where magic is, the magical system is martial arts based, and people conflict with each other via these martial arts styles. So they fight. It's physical.
Yeah.
And to have the main protagonist for a story involving trying to put a stop to a harmful war in this world, to have that main character be constantly trying to diffuse and avoid fights and stop fights and understand the people that are conflicting against him, that are in conflict with him, is go on.
Oh, just like his style of fighting physically reflects his approach to the greater conflict. Basically.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that sounds fascinating, because I know that's something we've talked about, that a lot of the other heroes we watched, that they don't have that. That like Captain America will give this impassioned speech about, the things we have to fight against. And then he winds up, it's never shown that they're dead, but slaughtering all these Hydra agents or whatever it is.
Right.
Who are obviously pretty bad people. But that seems like such an interesting way of so often we see that sort of conflict between the values you're fighting for and the way you're fighting for them. Is it fair to say Aang is sort of at the exact is it the furthest opposite end from the Punisher in terms of like the like I'm just seeing those two on the exact extremes of the continuum?
I would say that. I think that's a fair statement. Like if you look at Daredevil and Punisher, right? Daredevil's like, I won't kill people, and Punisher's like, I'm going to kill people. Right. And Daredevil's like, well, I won't kill people, but I'm going to just beat them over the head with a lead pipe, and like, I don't know, maybe they'll die, but they probably won't. This is a comic book, right? I'm going to throw them over a staircase, and we'll see what happens. Whereas, like, Aang is like, no, I mean, maybe he's going to do something. Somebody's going to run head first into a wall, right? Or they're going to fall off a ship or whatever. But his fighting style is more diametrically opposed to the Punisher, whereas Daredevil's more like kind of doing the same thing, but trying to like just do it like just a notch below, so it's not lethal.
Yeah, like Daredevil, Batman, so many Arrow, so many of these heroes seem to have an attitude of, I hate that I have to get my hands dirty, but to fight this terrible stuff, I've got to do terrible stuff. And it sounds like Aang doesn't even do that. Aang is just like, nope, I don't want to get my hands dirty while fighting this stuff, so I'm going to stick true to my values.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say literally never. Like, there are times when he does things, and I think probably people die, but he's not like, I'm going to kill those people. And when he does that, he's in this avatar state, and it's kind of like unclear how much he is him, and yada, yada, yada. Like the end of season 1 is what I'm referring to.
Right. We have actually talked for a long time about the character of Aang, but we did want to talk about a few other things, and I think it might be time to move on.
Yeah, let's talk about Toph.
If I can, because I wanted as a kind of a transition is to say, like, it sounds great that he does this, but what about his friends? Like, so maybe even just start with the character of Toph, but do the other characters mirror his fighting style, or do some of the other characters like Toph, I know you want to talk about, have different fighting styles?
A little different.
just a little bit.
A little bit. I'll let Jacob explain it.
So Toph, Toph is based off of Mantis style, and that has to do. Interestingly, there are similarities you could draw because there's a lot of the same kinds of limb trapping movements. So things where you would be trapping somebody's arm as it came in, and then making a strike. But Toph's a little more direct. Toph's very much in your face, and it actually comes up in a couple of the episodes that these two characters' personalities are in one major way diametrically opposed. Aang is, I'm going to move with things. I'm going to move out of the way. I'm going to move you out of the way, and I'm not going to confront you head on. And Toph is all like, I'm the rock. Mm-hmm. I don't move, you move, right? And it's a very different way of approaching life. And her personality, again, reflects this.
Now, Toph is the earthbender, right?
Correct. Toph is Aang's earthbending teacher. So for those who are not familiar with the trappings of the show, there are 4 elemental styles of bending: air, earth, fire, and water. And the avatar, which Aang is, there's one avatar, and the avatar-ness is reincarnated into new iterations following a particular cycle of a particular kind of bender. Air, earth, fire, water, or excuse me. Yes, that's right. Water, earth, fire, air is the cycle. Yes. So, in Toph's case, she's just an earthbender. In Aang's case, he gets to learn and can learn all forms of bending. He can use all forms of bending. So he picks up teachers along the way. Toph is Aang's earthbending teacher. It doesn't work out very well in the beginning because of this, because the way that she works is in that very sort of rigid, I am the immovable object. You're not going to move me. I'm the Blob is a bad analogy, but it's a good analogy for anybody who knows Marvel, where, doesn't have to do anything. You can't do anything to him.
Right.
And they are the diametrically opposed elements, too. It's like earth and air, right?
Right.
So the characters' personalities really go kind of with their bending.
Correct. In a lot of ways, what makes Toph interesting is that even though she is this very stubborn, in a lot of ways very passionate, and how else do I want to put this? Forceful, I guess it is fair to say. She's not a bully, I would say. She's not she's not abusing people constantly. Okay, maybe with her words. She likes to use her words. Because she's also like sarcastic and a joker. And God, I love Toph so much. So even in that, she's forceful in a way that's still not abusive. So I want to make sure that that's clear, because this is still a character we're saying is a hero and is allied with the heroes.
And that's a very important distinction, like the ability to use force without it being an oppressive, bullying kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Right. She's, in a lot of ways, her mentoring style mirrors Stick, but she differs in many ways from the character of Stick in that she's not quite as much of a problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, like Toph is a child, Aang is a child, and you have this one kid teaching the other kid, a new bending style, but they're both masters of their own styles, right? Whereas Stick, you have this older master of whatever fighting some war, training this kid and telling him he has to be in this war, basically, and training other kids, right? And so, in terms of like power dynamics, like Toph can be sarcastic to the other characters. Toph can be very exacting as a master of bending and a teacher, without having kind of a lot of the problematic power dynamics that you sometimes get in the martial arts, and you certainly get with Stick, I'd say.
Right. And that's another thing that comes up when she's training Aang, is that Toph's not big on positive reinforcement. That's not really her bag, right? Yeah. She's more than willing to tell Aang everything he's doing wrong. At one point, she's trying to, get Aang to sink down into his stance, try to get him rooted, get him centered. Mm-hmm. And she doesn't even look, and she says lower. And he goes, "You haven't even looked." Whatever, I know. Of course, that doesn't. That's
right.
A
Looking
little bit,
might not. Yeah.
That's a little bit funny, in a way, because Toph does share something in common with Stick, and it's something that I want to spend a little bit of time on. In that, Toph is blind.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, Paul, actually, I've spoken for a long time. Go into Toph's blindness for us, please.
Sure. So, I think, so her blindness is an integral part of her character, right? Like, I think she's grown up blind, right? Mm-hmm. She was always blind.
Blind, yeah.
But she lives, she has these very rich parents, and so she's brought up blind and like sheltered, and like her parents feel like she can't take care of herself, partially because she's blind, and maybe partially because she's a girl, and partially because she's a kid, and et cetera, et cetera. But, she kind of goes off and she learns earthbending and becomes, like, spoiler alert, the greatest earthbender, really, as far as I can recall in that series. And I feel like they handle her blindness very well, similarly to how they handle Aang being a vegetarian, in that it's an integral part of her character, but it's not the defining aspect of her character, right? Like, you wouldn't be like, Toph, the blind one. You'd be like, no, the badass earthbender who invented metal bending, right?
Right.
But that doesn't mean that, like, her being blind is just this kind of, like, random characteristic that doesn't really relate to any of her character, and that her personality, that didn't develop partially, through her experiences.
Right. It's one integrated part of a larger character, it sounds like.
Exactly.
Well, go ahead, Jacob. And then I have a question.
So there's something with Toph, and we were just talking about characters from Daredevil, so I want to draw this very firm contrast with Daredevil, in that So Toph and Daredevil are both characters that are blind. Matt Murdock is blind. Toph is blind.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, their unique powers give them the ability to observe the world, so that it's not as much of a hindrance as it would normally be.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think Avatar: The Last Airbender does a much better job with in treating a character with this, where they have a workaround, right?
Right.
They have a workaround for her disability in that she can see through her feet. She detects vibrations in the ground and up into other people, and so from there abstracts what's going on around her. But when someone throws something at her, she has no idea. She can't see it. Doesn't know. It's like she can try to hear it.
Yeah.
Right. But it's not like Daredevil, where he gets a whole complete 3-dimensional map, and basically like his handicap isn't a handicap.
Yeah.
Right?
She doesn't have sonar.
Right. Or there's one scene. Right. She doesn't have sonar. There's one scene where she's in the desert, and she makes it a point to point out to characters that like this is making everything seem really fuzzy. She's having a hard time identifying detail.
Oh, because the ground is so.
Exactly.
Yes, because the ground is a bunch of fine particles, and it doesn't create this nice pattern for her when she's moving around with her bare feet.
And
so,
also Oh, I was just gonna say, like, they spend a lot of time flying around on top of a sky bison. So like during all that time, she can't, quote unquote, see with her earthbending with her feet. So if they get attacked and they're up there, it's like that. She doesn't. The workaround doesn't. Basically, the workaround that she has doesn't apply nearly as often as it does for Daredevil.
For Daredevil specifically.
And, to me, that is so important, and I admit that's one more reason why I'm now even more excited to try and watch the show. Because, and I've talked before on this, but I think it's worth saying again. For me, as a person who is disabled, I'm often very frustrated with how you get characters like Daredevil, where on the one hand we're told that they're disabled, but they then have, either because of a superpower or a technology, so much of an ability to undo their disability and ignore their disability that it means that I don't relate to that character. I don't look at that character and say, that's a character who shares my experience and who I see myself on the screen in them. And I get, for a story about martial artists, you want people to have some magical abilities like that, and that's great. But that workaround seems like such a great way of making the character still have, incredible powers and incredible abilities that no one else has, but still have to deal with the kind of things that people with disabilities have to deal with, and have to have those kind of things where, the one little, you're in the desert, you would never think like that's the place where this would affect you, but it would. That's often the life of a person with disability, is having to navigate those things. And I'm really excited to hear about a character who does that, because frankly, in the superhero world, I can think of very few other examples who have.
There's a great scene involving Toph where her disability is actually in some ways an advantage. She meets up with Uncle Iroh, with Zuko, Prince Zuko's uncle. We talked about Prince Zuko a bit earlier. So the wizened old character that was following Zuko's around, who's really his mentor.
Who's the next one we're going to talk about? I definitely want to talk about them, but go on.
She gets frustrated with her. At one point, Toph gets frustrated with the rest of the people she's traveling with. She goes off on her own, meets up with this guy, doesn't know anything about who he is, even though there have been like wanted posters of these people around because the Fire Nation's now after them as renegades. Doesn't know who he is, just knows that he's this guy who came, who talked with her, who helped her through her problem that she was having with her friends and gave her some good advice. And so when they meet up with him later, she can see, quote unquote, see through the door that, oh, I know this guy. We're in good hands. This guy's going to be great. And they all see him, and this is somebody who they've seen as an enemy for this entire time. But because she was able to approach this person with a completely blank slate, she was able to connect with him in a way that the other characters weren't, and that creates this bridge for our protagonists to link up with these people who, as it turns out, aren't monsters, or actually reasonable people who want to change the world and make it better just like they do.
Well, and I think that's a great example of where, like, I know one thing we often talk about in the disability community is that it's about, I hate the term differently abled because I think it sounds ridiculous, but I like the concept of trying to say, like, that that the differences in humanity are important. And it's, because, people who experience the world, I know a lot of people in the deaf community won't even talk about themselves as being disabled. They think of it as a difference and a very important part of human diversity, and that they're no better or worse, and certainly not disabled. So I'm really glad for that, but I'm also really glad that you brought up these characters of Uncle Iroh and the Fire Nation, because it's a great transition to the third topic I know we want to talk about, which is this idea of adversaries. I want to start just with Iroh especially because, and again, here I'm the person who hasn't seen very much of it. I know very little. But Iroh is a character I know quite, or at least I recognize immediately, in probably the way I would only recognize the water bison, the sky bison. It's a pretty recognizable character. But I know,
Appa's great.
I know of Iroh because I've seen so many memes about, whatever you're doing, don't worry, Uncle Iroh still loves you, or still approves, or he would encourage you.
It's still Iroh.
Sorry.
We're going to try to stop you from
Iroh.
one more time. I was going to rage quit the podcast. No.
Uncle Iroh. Uncle Iroh.
But you're familiar with the character, even though you haven't really heard his name, right?
Because I've seen the written memes. But I saw all of these characters about how he is this incredibly benevolent, supportive person, and all you want is approval. I was kind of amazed that when we were talking to hear that he was actually part of the Fire Nation, who I thought was the bad guys. And so, let's talk about that character.
Oh, Iroh? Oh, man. Iroh's got a very rich story. So Iroh was a great general for the Fire Nation. He laid siege to the capital of the Earth Kingdom. It's the thing he's most known for. It's the siege of Ba Sing Se, capital of the Earth Kingdom. Which Ba Sing Se is the city that's surrounded by this enormous, up till this point and past this point even, impenetrable wall. And he's trying to get through, and has had many successes beforehand. Was the Fire Nation's greatest general, and there's a turning point moment for his character throughout this. At this point, he's still a true believer in the cause of let's unite the world under one banner. And then we'll all be happy because we won't have any conflicts. There will be one nation, etc. And then he gets notice that his son has died in the line of duty. And it just completely devastates him. He basically loses the will to fight. He comes home failing to complete his siege of Ba Sing Se, and is snubbed by the Fire Lord, is snubbed by the nation as, he didn't get it done. He's a quitter. He didn't have the stomach for the prolonged conflict. So anyway, Iroh is sort of this cast out in a way. And so he's sent with Zuko, who is banished by his father for effectively disrespecting, Zuko disrespects his father during a war meeting at one point.
Yeah, he asked a question.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're not saying disrespect. He's like, Dad, you dumb, and like flips the table and walks out. He just he asks a perfectly legitimate question of one of the other generals at the meeting, but because of a particular aspect of their culture, by stepping out of line during that meeting, who he offended was the person holding the meeting, who was his father. So he had to fight his father in this like kind of barbaric duel that they have set up called an Agnikai, excuse me, which is a firebending duel. And he refuses to do it, and he doesn't want to fight his dad. His dad actually scars him, not like scars him emotionally, like burns his face. So he's got a scar on his face for the rest of his life now, and then banishes him and says, "You can come back home when you've captured the Avatar."
Which is seen as like this impossible quest.
Right, because the Avatar hadn't been seen in like 100 years.
Yeah.
Right. So Iroh is sent off with Zuko. So they're both effectively exiles for different reasons. One is seen as a failure, and one is seen as an embarrassment. Really, they're both seen as failures and embarrassment, so they have that in common. And Iroh's trying to mentor Zuko, because one of the things he's come to realize over his years is that this whole Fire Nation conquering the world idea is not good. This whole war thing's kind of not okay. And he's joined the secret society called the White Lotus that's trying to put an end to these conflicts and embrace the ideas that the Avatar is not the enemy, among other things, that the Avatar is not bad, that the world needs balance, that the different cultures of the world need to be allowed to thrive, need to be respected, and be independent. And so he's slowly trying to work Zuko away from the kind of brainwashing upbringing he had, being the son of the leader of this nation that's engaging in this military conflict. And so it's a very slow progression for the character of Iroh. He's very complex. There's a lot going on. I've only kind of scratched the surface of his character.
Yeah, I'd say that Iroh is a character who's pretty much fully formed before the series starts, but whose depth is kind of revealed to us throughout the course of the series.
Mm-hmm.
And while Zuko is a character who is fairly simple at the beginning of the series, and he acquires depth through experience throughout the series. You know?
Yeah. In a lot of ways, there's a parallel with Zuko and Aang, in that they're both on a journey of self-discovery. Yeah. Only one of them realizes they're on a journey of self-discovery immediately, and the other one kind of twigs to it about halfway through. The moment where Zuko confronts his father during the Day of Black Sun is one of the best scenes in the entire show, because we've just painted this picture of a father who did a very horrific thing. That is not a one-off incident. His father is very abusive. He is not a good dad.
Yeah.
I want to make that very clear.
He wants to conquer the world, and he's like, I'm glad that my dad or granddad killed all the other airbenders. You know,
and he's
not a great person.
And he values of his two children, one is somebody who's generally conflicted and wants to do the right thing, and the other is actually a psychopath, and he values the psychopath more.
Yeah, because she's like him.
Yes, exactly.
So let me ask this, because obviously it sounds like the father is just straight up villain, antagonist. For Uncle Iroh and Zuko, the way the story is set up, you'd think that they would be at least villains or at least antagonists. Are they portrayed just as other protagonists who just happen to be on the other side of this conflict? How do they fall in terms of these hero villain antagonist protagonist questions that we're often discussing on the show?
Go on, Paul.
Oh, I'd just say that in season 1, they're the antagonists, right? And towards the end of the season, I mean, mostly Zuko is the primary antagonist for the most part in season 1. And there's a little bit of kind of doubt introduced there. And then season 2 is where that kind of really comes into question. And then season 3 is where he actually becomes a legitimate protagonist.
Right. Zuko is Aang's firebending teacher in the end.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He goes from hunting down the Avatar with the intent to capture him to restore his honor so he can rejoin his psychopathic family, to joining with the Avatar against the Fire Nation, in teaching Aang about how to teaching Aang his unique martial art. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that seems like such a powerful journey, because of this idea. So often I think we're frustrated by the breakdown of the world into good guys and bad guys, and heroes and villains, and it seems like that must be such a rich story where you really have the blurring of the line between antagonist and protagonist.
Right, and that's actually a recurring theme in the show, and we talked about this when we talked about Aang, where Aang likes to understand people. As a means of conflict resolution, and we find time and time again they have adversaries, people who are initially introduced as adversaries, who become their allies,
Interesting.
who end up becoming their friends or becoming people that help them along the way instead, because there isn't this dichotomy of they're the bad guys and we're the good guys, and they made a very satisfying thump when they hit the floor.
Right.
To make a Babylon 5 reference.
Yeah, great quote from Babylon 5. But yeah, no, I hear that, because I think that there is, we've talked a lot about how it's frustrating when shows portray people as just so clearly bad that you and the audience just get to enjoy any terrible thing that's done to them because they're so clearly bad.
Right.
And I love this idea of where the primary means of resolving conflict is by trying to understanding and trying to bridge the gaps. And see people from their own perspectives. Let figure out what is their own story that they want to tell, and how do we relate to that.
Paul, I know there's, like I said, this is a recurring theme. Can you think of any other, because this happens a lot, can you think of any other examples or characters that strike you as a very powerful story that start as adversaries for our protagonists and end up becoming their allies in some way?
In The Last Airbender?
Yeah, in The Last Airbender.
I mean, there's the swamp benders, right? Who they're at odds with, and then it's like, oh, you're water benders, right? Like, like, hey, and help us fight the Fire Nation, basically. Like, I mean, even in the like first couple episodes, it's like Aang is viewed as not as an antagonist to the Water Tribe, but as like a lion, and then they kind of work that out. But he is just like, yeah, okay, the Fire Nation wants me to go with them, I'll just go with them,
Right.
Like, like they're gonna destroy this village. Like, no, don't destroy the village. I'll go with you. And obviously Jet and his gang, right?
Right, his gang of freedom fighters. Yes.
Yeah, like they're basically, I guess they're like allies who turn out to be antagonists who then become allies
again.
Right?
Yeah, they're terrorists, right? When we first meet them, they're straight up terrorists.
I think freedom fighters is the
right. That's the word they use, but I don't like to mince words.
Yeah, and they just want to kill firebenders, basically. They're like, we're just gonna go kill, attack the firebending people, and I mean, the Fire Nation is made up of people, right?
Right.
It's like it's not all ships and
it's not just the military.
Soldiers. Right, exactly. And all we really see in the first couple seasons of the Fire Nation is mostly just the military. But in season 3, that's, book 3, Fire, basically. That's where Aang's going to learn firebending, but it's also where they go into the Fire Nation, right? To go try to accomplish, try to bring it down, basically.
And to find a teacher.
To find a teacher for Aang, exactly, because he wants to be a fully realized avatar, right, who has control over all 4 elements. But, like, in order to find a firebending teacher, you obviously need to find a firebender who's willing to teach it to you.
Turns out they only come from one place, really.
Right.
And so, like, that in particular, because up until that point, we'd seen a couple of Fire Nation people with faces, right? A couple of members of the Fire Nation who had personalities. But they do have this kind of stormtrooper-esque uniform. Yeah. Where they've got, like, the skull on their mask and all of that business.
They wear scary helmets.
So for the first 2 seasons, there's that whole, like, demonization aspect where you can, or dehumanizing?
Yeah, dehumanizing.
Of the Fire Nation people. And then in season 3, they start walking around and seeing characters who aren't Aang get their eyes opened a bit and be all like, oh, wait, there's like normal everyday people in the Fire Nation too, and some of them aren't even a big fan of the war, but they can't talk about it because there's this oppressive government. And it's
exactly. There's like kids in school who just want to dance, but like their government doesn't let them dance, like, Well,
and I think that is such a great storytelling technique because, we've talked about this before, but there are times when the camera only shows us the hero's view of the other side, that's all we're getting is in the audience. And so if all we ever see, Paul and I have been talking about this offline in terms of the Clone Wars show. We never see the people who live in the Separatist world, or even later in Star Wars, just the everyday, why does someone join the Empire, or join
who is the Empire? Like,
what are they doing? We never get to see that, and there's never any distinction drawn between what the heroes see and what the audience sees. And I think it's such a great storytelling technique and such a great way of twisting the ethical perspective when the camera allows us to sort of draw back and not only the heroes, but we in the audience get to see beyond the initial stereotype we had of, oh, they're all, stormtroopers, or they're all, fascists with skulls on their helmets, or what you guys are talking about.
Yeah. And as a kids show, like, which I wouldn't necessarily call it a kids show, but definitely you're not wrong to call it that, like it's
yes, kids can watch this show.
Right, exactly.
It's a show entirely for kids.
Right, and it was created and marketed in a way to attract an audience of kids, right? But I think also deliberately so that their parents would probably want to watch it with them, or people in their 20s or 30s would enjoy it. But like as a show that's supposed to appeal to kids, that has to appeal to kids, I think it's smart to show it, in the beginning, to make it feel a little simple, right?
Right.
A little like good and bad, good and evil, whatever. And then to show that like you can start with that perception, and then you can learn that there's a more complicated truth beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lot easier than being like, all right, everything's complicated right from the beginning. In a show like The Wire, maybe that makes sense to present it as complicated from episode 1, right? But like for a show that you really want to be able to bring kids in, and another thing is like it's 3 seasons, right? So when it's produced, I don't think those seasons come out that quickly. I'm not sure whether they were a full year apart or whatever, but like a lot of things like with the Harry Potter books and like a lot of series for kids, right?
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember that if they're read when the books come out, if the movies are seen when the movies come out, or the TV series is watched when each season comes out, the kid watching season 3 is 2 years older than the kid watching season 1.
No, and I think that's a great point. And actually, I was thinking of Harry Potter as you said that. It's kind of funny we keep going back to it because, I mean, in book one of Harry Potter, the world is incredibly simplistic, and by book 7, I wish the Slytherins had been given a little bit more depth. but other than that, it is a much more complicated world, and I think it very much mirrors like if a 10-year-old read book 1 and then a 17-year-old read book 7, they would that sort of journey.
Right.
And it's funny because also, I don't know if either of you have watched it. I've not gotten into it much, but I have a lot of friends who rave about the show Steven Universe.
I haven't, but I've heard similar gushings.
It seems very much in the same kind of a view of, the first season is kind of simplistic and childlike. But in later seasons, they're getting into some incredibly complicated issues of gender and sexuality and identity and violence and vengeance and punishment. Really complicated stuff. And I think you're right that by starting people on a simple level, you get to kind of build the ethical questions block by block and get into more and more complicated things.
Sure.
Yeah.
I haven't seen any Steven Universe, but it's that same kind of idea. And I think what's the most fascinating about this, specifically with the Fire Nation reveal, quote unquote, but also other parts of the series, is that we have 2 perspective characters, really. They don't always seem that way, but Katara and Sokka, in a lot of ways, are our perspective characters. We follow them through the show. We sort of are seeing the world in a lot of ways through their eyes. Sometimes we see it through Zuko's eyes, or like 1.5 eyes, or Toph's lack of eyes. Although she does have eyes, they just don't work the same way. But like most of the time, it's Sokka and Katara that we're seeing this. Their understanding of the world evolves. We evolve with them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like the audience is taken for that journey as these characters are themselves growing up, maturing, and understanding their place in the world and how their world works. And how they don't have this simple world of good and evil. It is complex. It is complicated.
And it makes a lot of sense for them and for us to kind of start off seeing that simple viewpoint, because it's like they're from the Southern Water Tribe, right? They live in the South Pole, and I'm pretty sure they never really ventured beyond their area, right? And it's not like this cosmopolitan South Pole tribe, whatever. It's like a village, basically. And maybe there's some more villages that we don't see. I'm not sure, but I think it's like pretty small, right? And I mean, I think they may have been decimated by the Fire Nation. I mean, we know that Katara's mom was killed by the Fire Nation, so she has this very much like, they killed my mom,
right.
They're the bad guys. And like, that's the perspective she has, right? And of course, they have this perspective of like, well, all we really know is the South Pole. And then they meet Aang, and he talks about some stuff, and they're like, okay, well, that's not how the world is. But like, they haven't really seen the world that much. So then when they go out on the journey with him, like, he is sort of re-experiencing the world. He already has this framework, since he saw the world as it was, which is very different than the world is when the series takes place. but he's like re-experiencing it. But they really are, I do feel like, the viewpoint characters. I often refer to characters like that as sort of like the audience avatars, you know?
Yes.
Where, you know, and I mean, Katara narrates the intro, right?
Yep.
So like, I'd say there's, you know, Aang is the title character, but she's definitely, out of all the characters, the most the perspective character, really.
Well,
Right.
And that's really important because this was actually kind of the question we've been going on for a while, so I want to kind of wrap up. But the kind of last question I wanted to ask, which I think you guys have already started to get to, but to kind of make it even clearer, is obviously it is Aang's story, and Aang is kind of the titular hero. But when we were talking before about how like Toph has a very different perspective, and some of the other members of Aang's crew have different perspectives. Is it fair to is that portrayed as like Aang has to be right in the end, or is it portrayed as that there could be different ways to see in the world and none of them has to be right? I mean, how is those sort of conflicts among Aang's allies and colleagues resolved in that way, or is it not resolved?
Well, they learn from each other.
Yeah,
it's beautiful. Now, and I'm dead serious about this. That sometimes Aang's not completely right. Sometimes Aang has to grow because he's very young, right? And that comes along. So one of the things that right away. So Katara is the most mature character in the group,
in the
mentally.
sort of generic way that we use the word mature.
Right. I'm generally saying that is that she is responsible.
Yes,
right?
She's by far the responsible one.
She's responsible. She's on task. She's organized. She is deliberate and wants to make sure that we're making good choices with our lives. Right. There are moments. Katara is one of my favorite characters because. A very good, strong female character, which the show has in abundance.
Yeah.
Which another great thing about it is it's a show aimed for kids, and it's not like the men are doing all the fighting and the women are doing all the fighting, but they're not as good as the men. That's not really how it is. No. One of the scariest villains in the show, one of the most powerful villains. I don't think Fire Lord Ozai is actually as frightening as Azula is.
Zuko's sister.
Yes, Zuko's sister is really powerful and and terrifying in a lot of ways, and not in the I don't know how to identify the trope. Not the crazy woman. It's not that because she's a woman she's terrifying. She's terrifying because she's very powerful and kind of not all like she doesn't think like we do, and it's very clear she doesn't think like we do or think of people like we do.
Right.
That sounds great. And so needed because it's not we don't get that kind of story very often.
Right. But anyway, so the characters when they're at conflict with each other, where they're at odds with each other, sometimes they fight, verbally, and sometimes they come away with a better understanding of each other. But it's never a case where like one person is held as the paragon of being right. Right. It's not like everyone. It's not one of those situations where everyone ends up apologizing to Aang at the end of the episode.
Right.
Which that's such a terrible trope, and I hate it.
Yeah.
But it's not like that, right? We're not presented with a situation where there's one person who is our compass for everything that is correct, and they're never wrong. Aang, we made a big noise about how we love his outlook on the world. We love how he's a pacifist, how he tries to understand people. But Aang is not perfect. No. And there are plenty of episodes that show you that, sometimes Aang doesn't make good choices, and has to live with those and has to learn from his compatriots who have a better idea about how to approach things and needs to sometimes accept that their idea about what to do is right. And I mean, the whole learning from each other, like he goes around eventually with 3 people who taught him martial arts. Yeah. Right, so he's literally learning from these people, and Sokka he learns from as well. The Xander character for all the Buffy fans.
Okay,
so true.
Sokka's the best Xander. So not to deep dive too much on Sokka, but there is this trope of the unpowered character in these forms of fiction where people have some kind of magic or gifts or what have you. And the other unpowered characters are there effectively only for comic relief.
Right.
Yeah.
And Sokka is don't get me wrong, there are a lot of jokes at Sokka's expense, some of which Sokka creates for himself.
Yeah.
But he is also a very key part of their team, and he does things that none of the other characters do. One of the things he's big in is he starts to understand technology, because there are some things, some mechanisms, some machines that they come across that he gets fascinating in, and he starts diving into that direction. So even though there's a lot of Sokka, what a dummy, he's actually not. He's also intelligent. He's just, doesn't have fancy magic martial arts technique.
Right. He comes up with strategies and and understands technology. And I mean,
go on.
Oh, I was going to say, like, there's an extent to which, like, within the context of this world, like, Sokka's kind of, like, disabled. You know what I mean? Like,
sure, right. So that's something they explore in the first season of Korra, but we're not going to talk Korra spoilers.
Well, I was trying to wrap us up because we're going a little bit over time, and I think 2, if not 3 of us have people waiting to have dinner on us. So we should try and wrap up. But I think we've gotten into some great issues here. And Paul, I just want to give you one last chance, see if there's anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up.
I guess that feels like a really weird thought to end on, so maybe I want to, like, say, like, 2 sentences about, like, what I mean.
Sure.
And how the word differently abled, or the phrase, like, always there, like, I know what you're saying, not necessarily from personal experience, but just from, like, the sound of the phrase. But, like, I also know what you're saying, like, people are saying about, like, the range of human experience, right?
Right.
And, like, Sokka has a different experience of the world than people who can literally bend the elements to their will, right? And I think there's an extent to which, because of that, because he has a different experience, he might feel like technology is more relevant to him. Like, he might connect with it more, instead of, like, a bender who's like, well, why don't I just bend that,
Right.
Like, a firebender's like, why would I make a tea kettle? I can just heat the tea with my brain, with my hand, with my martial art.
With my brain.
Well, no, I mean, that makes total sense to me. I think it's something that, like, I think when I think a lot about some of the great, like, superhero team-up movies we get, you get characters who have these, like, incredible godlike powers,
right.
And then someone like Hawkeye who can shoot a bow and arrow, or
right.
or
even just Batman and Superman.
Exactly.
When they team up.
Batman's superpowers, he's disgustingly wealthy.
Exactly.
Like, literally can buy whatever. Or he's the world's greatest detective. It depends on the plot line, I think.
Right. It depends on whether it's Zack Snyder or...
We did it! We got it!
I get the Zack Snyder point for today's podcast. All right, that's my closing argument.
There you go. Okay, well, we've gotten a lot of great stuff said. We've gotten to dig in at Zack Snyder. Thank you guys both. I think it was really exciting to have both you on, get all 3 of us to be talking. And for everybody else who's been listening, we've all had our say. What do you guys think? What are your thoughts on Last Airbender? Is there questions we didn't get into, or questions you disagree with? Favorite episodes or stories you have in terms of things that just made you think, made you question ideas? Because I think what's most important to me and what I hear about this is the way it is teaching some really great things about how people see the world, how easy it is to see the world just through the lens of what you've learned, or just through the lens of good and bad and black and white. And that this is really about challenging things. So what are ways in which the show challenged you, or what are ways in which this podcast challenged you and you disagree with? Let us know. You can contact us on Facebook or on Twitter at Superhero Ethics. You can also email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. Anyway, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Jacob, on behalf of Paul, thank you guys all for listening. Please tune in next time, and have a great day. Paul, have you been doing any more writing you want to let people know about?
No.
Okay.